Hello, everyone, and welcome. The webinar will begin in just a second. Feel free to follow us on social media. On Twitter, follow us at Reading by Third, and on Facebook, it's at Campaign for GLR. Feel free to tweet using the hashtags GLR Reading and hashtag Learning Tuesdays, and we will be sure to retweet. Once again, the webinar will begin shortly. Once again, feel free to connect with us on social media. At Twitter, follow at Reading by Third, and on Facebook, follow at Campaign for GLR. Okay, hello everyone. My name is Sierra Sanchez, and I will be working behind the scenes to produce this webinar. I just wanted to share a few housekeeping tips before we get started. First, feel free to introduce yourself in the chat box. Feel free to list your name, state or city, and which organization you are from, if any. Be sure to select both panelists and attendees when posting in the chat box so that we all know who is here. All attendees are in listen-only mode, but we encourage your engagement through that chat box. Feel free to post your questions in the Q&A box, and we will be sure to get to them within the last portion of the webinar today. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available to everyone who registered. And this webinar is being live streamed on Facebook. Lastly, please feel free to take the brief on-screen evaluation that you see during the Q&A portion. This just helps us with our commitment to continuous improvement at the Campaign for Grade Level Reading. Lastly, before we begin, I just wanted to turn your attention to a few of our upcoming webinars that we have every Tuesday. Later today at 3 p.m. Eastern Time, we have The Future of Early Math, What Science and Practice Tells Us. Next week on Tuesday, November 17th, we have two back-to-back. First, at 12:30 p.m. Eastern Time, we have Making Small Moments Big for Children's Early Brain Development with the Clinton Foundation. And at 3 p.m. that day, we have Parent Coaching, a Key Ingredient to Parent and Child Success. On November 24th, 2 weeks from now, we have Teaching Early Reading with a Digital Mindset. And lastly, on Tuesday, December 1st at 3 p.m., we have Virtual Tutoring, How Programs Are Pivoting to Combat Learning Loss. Alrighty, thank you so much, and I hope you enjoyed the webinar. Joining you now is Jenny Atkinson.
Thanks, Sierra. I'd like to welcome all of you to our second Crucible of Practice Salon. We have created this webinar series to provide a deep dive exploration of how community coalitions are approaching and moving the work to improve early school success prospects of children from economically challenged families, neighborhoods, and communities. If the first time you saw the phrase Crucible of Practice Salon, you headed to the dictionary or thought, I should really look that word up, you are not alone. So I wanted to spend a minute talking about the phrase and the word crucible, which means, quote, a place or situation in which concentrated forces interact to cause or influence change or development. A place or situation in which concentrated forces interact to cause or influence change or development. I think this acknowledges, first of all, that this work we're all doing is hard. We're trying to make early school success something that every child experiences, often with fewer resources than we'd like, and usually in places that are already under-resourced. I think Crucible of Practice also acknowledges that we aren't doing it alone. A place or a situation in which concentrated forces, we are, and our coalitions are those concentrated forces. In our communities and in this network, we need to be working together and learning together as a concentrated force. The phrase also illustrates that the work we're doing in communities is where we figure out these solutions. We take good ideas and great research, and then we gather our stakeholders together and figure out how to make it work in our communities. We are the crucible. So our goal here is to illuminate the factors and dynamics that combine as the definition states, to cause or influence change or development. In each Crucible of Practice Salon, we hear from a community lead and other members of that coalition and community who speak directly to how they're doing this work and how their stakeholders are partnering together to create momentum and synergy. On the next slide, you'll see the broad range and breadth of the Campaign for Grade Level Reading Network. It's exciting to see that there are so many places figuring out how to do this work in a sustainable way and at scale. In addition to our What's Working community challenges on CLIP, our learning platform, where communities share what they're doing, we see these Crucible of Practice salons as an opportunity to dig even further into that work that communities are doing. It's our chance to get behind the curtain and see in more detail how the work is being done. After hearing from a community, we'll have time for further questions and conversation. We really want these Crucible of Practice salons to be a place where we can all learn from each other while we're doing this critical work in real time. Today, we will hear from representatives of Read Charlotte. And you'll see on the next slide that our conversation will be focused on choosing and implementing evidence-based strategies and a discussion about how they're doing that in Charlotte. On the next slide, you'll see our presenters, who include Monroe Richardson and Sonia Castellino with Read Charlotte, Kim Perkins with the Helps Education Fund, Jenny Ward from Bank of America, and Johanna Anderson at the Belk Foundation. So now I'd like to introduce our moderator and presenter, Monroe Richardson. Monroe is the executive director of Read Charlotte, a community initiative that unites families, educators, and community partners with the goal of improving third grade reading proficiency in Mecklenburg County to 80% by 2025. In this role, he's responsible for using research, data, and strategic funding to coordinate, integrate, and align the efforts of dozens of organizations across Charlotte-Mecklenburg to improve children's language and literacy development from birth through third grade. Monroe has worked in philanthropy for most of the past 20 years. Read Charlotte is his 5th startup venture. Monroe holds a bachelor's degree from the University of Kansas, master's degrees from both Harvard University, where he was a Mellon Fellow, and Oxford University, where he was a Rhodes Scholar, and a PhD from the University of Illinois. He's a co-author with Samantha Cleaver of Read With Me, Engaging Your Young Child in Active Reading, published by Rowman and Littlefield in November of 2018. And I can tell you that it's a book well worth reading. Every time I hear Monroe speak about what he and the Read Charlotte team are doing, I learn something new. So I'm thrilled that he's here to talk about their work. Welcome, Monroe.
Thank you, Jenny. We are excited to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me and having the opportunity to talk with everyone about the work we do in Charlotte. I'm excited to follow my friend and colleague, Jenny Bagoni, from Read by Fourth, that kicked this series off. And I think it's really an important opportunity for all of us to learn from each other and to really hear the story behind the story. So thanks to all of you that came today, and thanks for the opportunity to share a little bit about our work. So as Jenny said, next slide, we are a 10-year initiative in Charlotte, North Carolina. Our focus is to get 80% of our third graders reading by 2025. If you're doing the math, we've got 5 years left, and that's a big goal. And we knew that a really important part of the work was going to be to really bring together families, educators, and community partners around a shared set of strategies, so that we really gave ourselves the best chance at significantly moving children's early literacy by getting everyone together on the same page. Over time, we've developed a model, next slide, that really orients our focus around 80%. Our entire board, our entire staff is focused around this goal. You could go around Charlotte and ask people, what is Read Charlotte all about? And they will tell you about our North Star goal of 80%. Today, we would really say that there are these clear components around the 80%. Families and pre-K3 instruction isn't critical. There's work that we do and support around tutoring and summer learning. There's work that we do in what I would call R&D work, research and development, where we're trying to dig deeper and to figure out new strategies and new learnings. And then advocacy, which is an important part of our work and where we choose to focus to advocate on what works. Next slide. Part of what attracted me to come to Charlotte was this real focus from the beginning on the part of the community leaders that put together Read Charlotte to really ground our work in evidence. And I know that these days, evidence-based has become a buzzword, much like research-based before it was a buzzword. And so I'm excited today to have the opportunity to talk to you about how do we approach this notion of evidence in Charlotte, and how might this be of assistance to you in your work in your communities. Next slide. So I want to note that there are two big or main types of evidence. There's evidence-based practice, and there's practice-based evidence. So evidence-based practice, I think of it in terms of the vaccines, right, that are being developed right now. And there's experimental work to determine, is this effective and for who and by how much? So when we say evidence-based practice, that's what we mean there. But there's also really important wisdom that's often in our communities, in our classrooms, in our nonprofit programs, and it may not have had an experimental study to show that it works, but there are ways to learn from our community in what's called practice-based evidence, to look at what has been successful in some cases that's outperforming similar groups or classrooms, and to try to get your arms around an understanding of that practice-based evidence as well. Now, today we're just going to talk about evidence-based practice, but for those of you that are interested more in this notion of practice-based evidence, I really recommend Dan and Chip Heath's book, Switch, that has a wonderful chapter in the beginning where they talk about going to rural Vietnam and trying to solve the problem of malnutrition. It's a wonderful example of practice-based evidence that unfortunately we don't have time to talk about today. Next slide. So one of the main things that we really want to be careful about when it comes to looking at evidence, and I'm sure you all have been inundated with groups that are trying to sell you products, or they've got the best solution and they say, this is evidence-based. Well, the thing that we want to watch out for is something called bias. And what we really want to understand is, was it really this intervention that led to the improved outcomes that we care about? Or was there something different about the children or the classrooms or the schools or families that were using it? Is it possible that there's another explanation for why we got the change in results that we did? And so we really want to make sure that when we are looking at an evidence-based program, that we understand enough about how well was it designed or studied. And so the research designs that are used to determine whether something is in fact effective and therefore evidence-based really are trying to focus on this issue of removing bias, whether it's selection bias, we selected the best students, or we selected the best teachers, and that's why we got the results that we did. Next slide. So the ESSA, the Every Student Succeed Act, which is the reauthorization of the Elementary and Secondary Education Act, for the very first time defined evidence-based. And so this was a really big step forward. And there are 4 tiers of evidence that are defined in ESSA. The first is tier 1, which is randomized control experimental studies. We've all heard of this. The vaccines that are being tested, they are using randomized control studies. And the best characteristic of this is there is a so-called experimental or treatment group, and there's a control group. And people get assigned into one or of the other group randomly. So that's the randomness part of it. That's considered the gold standard, the top tier. And by randomizing and showing that the two groups don't vary in any important ways, that gives us more confidence that any outcomes we see are because of whatever the intervention was. Now, we can't always do the randomized controlled studies. So the next best option is tier 2. And this is considered quasi-experimental, not quite experimental, but quasi-experimental. And in this case, instead of a randomly assigned control group, what you have is a comparison group. And the way that this comparison group is constructed is you try to find another group of students or families or schools that are matched to the group that got the intervention. And so this is called a quasi-experimental study. And so the randomized control study and the quasi-experimental study are the 2 most common ways that you will see that are used to demonstrate evidence and effectiveness of an intervention. Now, ESSA also defines two other tiers. The third tier is correlational studies, and this is where you don't have a control group, but what you try to do is to statistically control for these different potential explanations for why you got the results. And so, as ESSA says, this is promising, but it's certainly not the moderate or strong evidence. And then the very bottom level is what they call demonstrates rationale. You've got a defined logic model, you've got a theory of action supported by research, and you've got some study underway to see whether it's effective. In our work, we really have a strong preference for tier 1, for random control studies. And we will look at this tier 2 quasi-experimental if we have to, but we really are trying to go after the randomized control studies because we really want to try to find what are the studies that have the best evidence that they can actually move the needle on outcomes we care about. Okay, next slide. So back in 2016, with this in mind, we began a major review of the literature. And so we scoured over 30 databases and clearinghouses. We also looked at meta studies and systematic reviews. We didn't just look at, let's say, what the What Works Clearinghouse told us. We actually read the research papers themselves so we could have a sense of our own sense of how effective are these, for who did it work. We didn't just look for programs, we also looked for practices, curricula, program models that had evidence that they could move the needle on outcomes that we thought were really important. We reviewed the research ourselves, and we also paid attention to what did not show evidence of impact. And that, although we don't talk about it very often, has been a very, very valuable source of information for us as we constantly sift through a whole sea of options of things that we could possibly support here in Charlotte, North Carolina. Lastly, we also paid attention to cost and level of effort. Just because something is shown to be effective doesn't necessarily mean it's the right thing for you. Sometimes it costs a lot of money or it's really hard to implement, and that's an important consideration as well. Next slide. So what did we learn? Well, many literacy interventions have actually never been rigorously tested. We had some working groups back in 2016 that gave us all sorts of ideas of things to look for. And some of our working group members were former teachers. But what we learned was many of the interventions had actually never been rigorously tested like you would with a vaccine. We found that some had mixed results. There might be one study that shows there's an effect and then another that shows no effect. And then for those that did have impacts or effects, they actually had small impact. And so that was something we had to take in mind. The level of effort or complexity for implementation varied quite a bit. And what we learned was we don't talk enough about failure, what didn't work. And we think that's really important because failing to talk about this deprives us of the opportunity of learning and figure out how to make things better. But one thing I really want to stress, and I want to make sure you take away, is that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. I'm going to say that again. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. Just because we don't have a rigorous study doesn't mean it doesn't work. It just means we simply don't know enough to develop a degree of confidence about what are we likely to see out of that intervention. And I think it's also a call or an opportunity to learn more and to actually do some good testing to get better information about the effectiveness of that intervention. So a couple of times you've heard me use the term effect. And I'm sure that all of you at some point have heard the term effect size. If you've been on any of these databases or clearinghouses, you'll see that, that term used. And I want to explain for you what is an effect size. Next slide. So whenever we have students who take an intervention or a test, even or participate in a program, we don't get, although we talk about averages, what really happens is we get a range of scores, right? And while there's an average for the group, the actual scores, if we were to plot them out, actually are a range. And so if you look at, for example, this dark curve here, the dark gray, you actually see a spread, right? So there's an average, which would be the little light white line you see in the middle, and then a range of scores that are there. Statisticians actually have a way to measure the spread of results from the average, and they actually call that standard deviation. So if you've ever heard that term and wondered what it meant, it is a measure of the spread from the average or the mean. And so when we are able to have a treatment group and a control group, what we're really interested in is what is the difference between the means of those two groups and what does the spread look like from the averages of those two groups. And that's how we think about how we measure impact, and that's how we measure an effect size. And so to visually show this to you, what I have here on the screen is actually an example of what it would look like if you had two groups and you had a group in blue that got an intervention and a group in gray that was the control group. That blue space that isn't overlapped, that's your impact. That's a way for you to visually see what is the impact of this intervention. And so we're going to use this model, this visual model, to show you what is the impact that we see across typical literacy interventions and what we found in the work that we've been doing for the last 4.5 years. Next slide. Okay, so this is the first one. This is the typical effect size on a narrow literacy outcome. So what's a narrow literacy outcome? These are ones where we're able to focus in on specific subskills. So for example, things like phonemic awareness, letter identification, letter sounds, phonics, vocabulary fluency. The typical intervention, literacy intervention, actually has an impact that's quite small. If you see that small blue space, that is the impact of the typical intervention. And the number there is 0.17. That's a measure of standard deviation. But what I like to do is actually help you understand that in plain English. So I get this notion from actually vaccine work, where they actually have a number that they know in medicine, and it's called number needed to treat. And it simply says, how many people do we need to treat before we have someone who has a better outcome? Well, we can flip that upside down and ask the question, how many people out of 100 are likely to have improved outcomes? In this case, from the typical literacy intervention that's focused on a narrow literacy outcome, we will see 7 additional children or participants with improved outcomes. So if you would assume, for example, that 40% of kids will be on level or do well, then a typical literacy intervention will add a 7 additional, and you'll have 47 out of 100 with positive outcomes. If that looks like a small number, it is. Okay, next slide. Now, this is the same thing, but on broad literacy outcomes. And the two big ones for us in the literacy world are comprehension and reading achievement. And again, look how small that blue space is, right? And again, in plain English, we expect 3 out of 100 participants to have improved outcomes compared to if they had been in the control group. So if 40% would have achieved positive outcomes anyways, then we would expect 43 out of 100 to have positive outcomes as a result of a typical literacy intervention. Now, I don't want to depress anyone and I don't want you to feel down. We do have good news, but I will tell you, back in 2017, when we began to do this work, I certainly was down in the dumps because it sure seemed that not a lot of stuff had a lot of evidence that it could create an impact. And for those of us that are doing the hard work that Jenny said, this begins to give us a sense of why is it, despite all of the hard work we're doing, we're not seeing the improvements in reading outcomes that we would like to see. So next slide, some of you might be asking the question, so what about statistical significance? I've heard that before. This simply refers to how likely is it that the difference in the impact we saw, the differences in the group averages were by chance alone. The standard benchmark is less than a 5% chance that the difference was by chance alone. It is possible to have a large effect that's not statistically significant, that's more likely to happen with small studies, but that's what that means. But statistical significance doesn't tell you, yes, this is really impactful and it's going to make a difference for us. It just simply tells you what's the chances that these differences were just by chance. Okay, so next slide. So we took all of this information, and one of the things that we did was we really wanted to have a sense of, we wanted to know, what should we do? What does the world look like overall? So we went from looking at, okay, what are we finding in terms of the effectiveness of interventions, and then how do we use that information to make decisions? So next slide. back in 2016, one of the things we were able to do was actually download a big spreadsheet of outcomes from the What Works Clearinghouse. And we were able to average what's the average impact that we were seeing across a whole bunch of outcomes. And the challenge initially was, well, what do we do with this? How do we make decisions? So we actually, at some point, decided that we actually needed to figure out how do we compare these different interventions to each other. So we decided to benchmark them. Next slide. So I shared before that narrow outcomes, or phonemic awareness, letter ID, letter sounds, phonics, fluency, vocabulary, they tend to have bigger outcomes, right? You saw the slightly bigger space. On the right-hand side, you see that's the benchmark. That's the 7 out of improved outcomes. We found a number of interventions that had effects or impact that were larger than the typical intervention. And our goal was to not take anything that could not at least meet the average or typical intervention rather, and try to find things that could do better. Next slide. We also did the same thing in looking for outcomes that had, or interventions or strategies that had broad outcomes like comprehension and reading achievement. If there's any pattern that you see here, is that these outcomes, or effect sizes rather, that are in purple are much lower. They're much closer to 0, which shows no impact. And of course, there's a couple of things that we found even had negative impact. This is important information for us because it gives us a sense of just how to understand the world. That when we see something new, or that someone presents an idea to us, it helps us figure out how does this rank compared to other things that we've done, and what do we think about it? Next slide. So we selected what we thought were the very best interventions for us here in Charlotte to support. And as you can see, overall, the portfolio of strategies that we support, which run the gamut of programs, practices, models, really have outcomes, or I'm sorry, effect sizes that are larger than what we typically see from our benchmark programs and practices, and gave us some sense of how do we think, what do we expect to get out of this, and on what outcomes, and why do we have confidence that these are the right things to support. Next slide. If you're interested in learning more about this, there's a paper that I highly recommend here. I only came across this last year because it was published last year, but it really makes a case of focusing on practical benefit instead of just looking at statistical findings. And that's really what we're trying to do here. Next slide. So I want to highlight this, what we've done. Oh, sorry. Before I do that, it's really important, and I really want to stress this. Don't just go after interventions with the largest effect sizes. It may not be right for you. And the National Implementation Research Network has a wonderful diagram. They call it the hexagon tool that allows you to kind of help think about, this is the right thing for you. Is it the right thing to do based on what your needs are in your community and how it fits in with what you already have? And then can we do it in the right way? Can you actually implement it as it's intended to be implemented? And there are a number of models, national programs that we might see, but because of what's already here in our ecosystem in Charlotte, North Carolina, it may not be right for us. And it's the same thing for you. So there may be things that we're doing in Charlotte that may not be right for you, but I think the overall approach will help you make good decisions. So next slide. So I want to highlight what we've done and our approach with one program in particular, and that's HELPS. It stands for Helping Early Literacy with Practice Strategies. And as you can see, there's a nice little blue space over there. And again, this blue area is the impact of the intervention. We expect 35 out of 100 children to have improved outcomes because of the HELPS program based on the work. There were 5 randomized controlled trials, really rigorously tested, 15 years of work behind it. And we felt like it really ticked all the boxes for what we were looking for. Next slide. So one of the reasons I like this is that reading fluency is referred to as the forgotten literacy skill. We spend a lot of time talking about phonics and comprehension, but really fluency is the bridge between the two. It's the importance of reading with speed, accuracy, and good expression. It's really a part of a basket of important code-focused skills. And importantly, through the work we've done over the last several years, I truly believe that fluency is a low-hanging fruit opportunity. We believe we can improve third grade proficiency by 20 to 25 percentage points with a targeted focus on reading fluency in grades 1 to 3 alone. I'm happy to talk more about this in the Q&A. Next slide. Fluency is highly correlated with third grade outcomes. We were fortunate in Charlotte that there was a cohort study done of students from kindergarten to third grade. And these were students that finished third grade in spring of 2019. At the end of first grade, there was a 70% correlation with their reading fluency scores and their eventual performance on a North Carolina State third grade reading test. At the end of second and third grade, that grew to 75 and ultimately 79%. Fluency matters. And so this is a really important opportunity to be able to target kids that need their support. Next slide. HELPS combines 8 research-based strategies. I won't go through all this, but there's a lot of work and it really combines a lot of good research that tells us what kids need. Next slide. It also has really good implementation benefits. It's evidence-based, research validated over 15 years. It's heavily scripted, relatively easy to learn. I was a HELPS tutor. If I can do it, anybody can do it. 3.5-hour initial training, time and volunteer efficient. Kids need 3 20-minute doses a week. And there's ways you can organize volunteers. Our panelists will talk about that. It can be integrated into existing efforts, existing programs and organizations. It can be delivered as equally well by trained teachers, teacher assistants, and volunteers. How many interventions can you say that about? You can get to 90% plus tutor fidelity with 10 or more sessions. It's low cost. The materials are available for free at helpsprogram.org. Wonderful program. Next slide. So the other thing we like about it is that oral reading fluency scores can be used to select students for the program. So you can be really clear about getting the right students at the right time, and it's appropriate for students starting in the middle of first grade. Next slide. So that helps. Our panel is going to tell you a little bit more about it, but I want to talk to you for a minute about 2 ways to measure impact. So we talked at the beginning about control groups and comparison groups. But I think one of the things that we often struggle with is how do we measure and communicate impact? We need to do that for ourselves, for schools we partner with our funders. And I want to talk to you about 2 ways to measure impact. We're going to talk about it for HELPS, but I think you can apply it for other things that you probably are using in your community as well. So first way to measure impact is how much do we close gaps from the beginning of the year to expected end of year benchmarks. And the second way that we can measure impact is how much do our outcomes that we see exceed expected growth based upon national norms. Next slide. So strategy 1, gap closing. Here in North Carolina, for a number of years, we've used DIBELS. It's changed in recent years, but the DIBELS assessments are available for free online, and the benchmarks are available as well. For fluency, I'm going to focus on one thing that's important. The DIBELS end of year benchmark for oral reading fluency is 100 words correct per minute. Okay, so that's an important benchmark that we can use to measure gap closing. Next slide. So when we started with HELPS in year 1, we focused on third graders. And our beginning third graders started reading with 51 words correct per minute. They were at a 23rd percentile on average. They were at a beginning reading level of basically a second grader. They were a full year behind. And we knew that because of the national benchmark from DIBELS, we needed to get them to 100 words correct per minute by the end of the year for them to be on track. Next slide. So what happened? Well, we used this notion of closing the gap. How much do we close the gap? And I never steal ideas, I give credit. So a colleague of ours at the Duke Endowment named Todd Dalrymple gave me this great suggestion as we were trying to wrestle with how to talk about it. We're able to talk about how much did we close the gap. What we found was this is beautiful stair-step progression you see here. We had 10 schools, 155 third graders, 5,866 tutoring sessions delivered by 116 tutors. Children who got 50 or more help sessions closed 75% of the gap. Children who got 40 or more sessions closed 63%. And children who got 30 or more sessions closed 57% of the gap. It's a beautiful stair step. And I think we can plausibly make the claim that the more tutoring sessions they got, the more we closed the gap. In other words, there was a relationship between the tutoring they received and the outcomes, the gap closing that occurred. Next slide. So we had a second year of HELPS, which unfortunately got truncated by the virus, but we were fortunate enough to be able to get both beginning and middle of year data. And so we're able to report middle of year results. So in our second year, We had 13 schools. We had 227 students, but this time 90 second graders, 137 third graders, 5,679 tutoring sessions delivered by 274 tutors. What you see here is the results for second graders. And what we saw was students who got 41 or more sessions closed 95% of the gap to where they needed to be. That's extraordinary. And then students that got 31 to 40 sessions closed about 47%. Students who got between 11 and 30 sessions closed about 37% of the gap. And then the final group, they just barely got started. So if you got less than 10 sessions, you probably started late, not much gap closing. It's what you'd expect. All right, next slide. Similar for third grade, not as dramatic, not 95% gap closing for 41 plus sessions, but 75% acceptable. And then we also saw, again, that stair step, not as neat and clean as the second grade, but again, you generally see it there. These were amazing results. I was so excited about what was going to happen end of the year, and then COVID came. So this will always be frozen, kind of like a prehistoric animal in the ice. But really showed that you really could see and demonstrate that we were actually able to close gaps. Next slide. All right, so the second strategy for how to communicate impact using those national norm data is to look at how much growth are we actually expecting students to see based on where they started. And we have actually fortunate to have lots of good nationally normed data. And in this case, we're showing you the data for oral reading fluency, but you can find it for other measures as well. And in this case, again, for our first year students that we implemented, we had all third graders. They were reading at the beginning of the year on average at 51 words correct per minute. They were expected to add 17 words correct per minute by the middle of the year to get to 68. And then they were expected to add another 10 words correct per minute to get to 78 words correct per minute by the end of the year. This is the normal trajectory for a student that's starting off on a 23rd percentile. In other words, a third grader who's starting off at a second grade level. Next slide. So I'm going to go back again. Remember, we talked about how many children out of 100 would we expect to see improved outcomes, right? So the average intervention for a broad outcome like fluency is 7 out of 100. We picked HELP because it has 5 times the impact, right? So we expect, and we were able to benchmark our expectations based on a 35 out of 100. So how did we do? Next slide. What we saw was 71 out of 155 HELP students, that's 46%, exceeded their expected growth. Now, I showed you the average. We actually looked at each individual child, where they started, and where were they expected to end based on the national norms. 46%, almost half, exceeded their expected growth. Of the 31 students who got 50 or more HELP sessions, remember, they're the ones that made the most impact, 21 or 65% exceeded expected growth. We thought that was really great results. We did it again in our second year. Next slide. And this time we had second and third graders. For second graders, we actually had 60% of our 90 students exceed expected growth through the middle of the year. And then for third graders, we actually had just over 50% exceed expected growth at the middle of the year. Why this is important is that we actually found in our first year that students actually continued to power through and make good progress in the second semester. That was similar to what they did in the first semester. And remember, I just showed you that students typically slow down their growth in the second semester. That's one of the reasons I was so sad, among many, about the pandemic, because I just knew we were going to blow through the results. Next slide. So I'm excited to share with you how we've approached thinking about evidence, using evidence, benchmarking interventions, picking interventions, using data like that to measure and communicate impact. But the real important question is, how do we do this? And I'm really excited to invite in members of our panel to share with you the story behind the story about how this was accomplished here in North Carolina. Our first panelist is my partner in crime, Sonia Castellino, who is the Deputy Director of Read Charlotte. Sonia's been with us since July of 2018, and that's an important date because we actually began to do local field tests in Charlotte in the spring, so she came in just in the beginning. Sonia is a former educator, but as I say, once an educator, always an educator. She's got a wonderful little boy, Dalton, who she tries out a lot of stuff from Read Charlotte on. I'm excited to have her share with you the story behind the story for implementation. Sonia.
Thanks. Hopefully you guys can hear me. I'm coming to you live from Dalton's high chair in my kitchen. I'm really excited to share some things with you and dig into a few select weeds of what we did and why. But first, I want to back up and just let you know that this is all grounded. Everything that I'm going to share with you that I've executed to plan and perform is in service of the vision and the goal that was already set by Monroe and Read Charlotte before I arrived. 80 by 2025 through evidence-based practices and practice-based evidence. And the research that Monroe had done before I arrived resulted in 5 suggested levers for community to invest in service of raising the literacy proficiency rate. And that is supporting great classroom instruction, providing books for home libraries, high quality targeted tutoring, in which helps is the main component we're talking about today, family literacy routines, and stopping summer learning loss. So the stage was already set when we think about that hexagon tool. Charlotte was ripe to take advantage of this program from the work that had already been done before I arrived. By the time Monroe started looking for me to come and execute, there was a group of people that wanted to do these things already. And for tutoring in particular, there were groups in Charlotte already working on tutoring, and Read Charlotte had helped start a tutoring program for kindergarten students. And we were now looking for something to help with those other skills. All right, so I'm going to walk you through 3 chunks of time of execution between spring 2018 and the winter of 2018-19, because I want you to understand that we were able to produce results for kids that were meaningful, kids who need it, in less than an entire school year. And so you can do this too. The first chunk of time from spring of 2018 to summer of 2018, Monroe was vetting helps so he could pilot the implementation in Charlotte and ensure that our local context could support the same implementation. If we could do that, then we knew that the outcomes would follow because the research said so. Monroe was able to move very quickly because Helps Education Fund is a great partner, really easy to work with. And also it just happened to be divine intervention. He'll say this to people all the time, that the group that started the tutoring program was also in our same state. And so we were physically close by and could share information and visit each other. So that was really helpful for us. Monroe invited me to attend a tutor training session and asked my opinion. And by the end of it, I was trying to figure out what had to happen for tutors, and then how could it go wrong, and therefore what had to change. So kind of some failure mode analysis. And I asked myself 3 questions and gave him some answers on it. What did tutors really need to be able to say and do by the end of the training session so that they could get started well and confidently? How much can an average volunteer handle for this training session? The time commitment, the amount of information going in and out before the scales tip and they start making mistakes or they decide to quit. That was the failure that I was nervous about. And then how can we make good decisions moving forward or improvements that don't compromise the tutor's implementation? Because I knew that fidelity to the program was so important. So we made key changes to support fidelity of the program at the same time, minimizing the risk of volunteer errors and quitting, such as shortening the training session to a minimal amount where the tutor could get started confidently, like I said. And then we also realized that there were things that we didn't know. And so the more that I learned about the program and the more that we tested it out, we knew we'd need to keep going back to the training to figure out how to support tutors. So that was the main learning from spring to summer. Then from summer to fall, I know that's not a very long time period, but the school year was coming to open. And I knew that I needed to now focus on making proof points over the school year because we had tested out the implementation over the summer. This was made really easy for me because Monroe and Reed Charlotte had already stabilized and begun relationships with strong and flexible partners. Monroe had already set a base for a coalition of schools and community leaders, as well as had started to establish members for an implementation advisory group to help me. So we had some school leaders' permission to come in and serve their students. And then we also had community leaders who were already excited about supporting tutoring and then about learning and hearing about HELPS and what it could do. So I began by investing in this advisory implementation group. These were experienced community leaders who I was looking to advise our success. We were learning from their best practices, trying to avoid their mistakes, and coming together collectively to support our community's children. I also leaned in and listened to these key community leaders who had already been helping to bring tutors to the table for that kindergarten program. And I wanted to hear what was appealing to them about the potential of bringing volunteers to HELPS. And what I heard from a lot of them was that they really liked the touch points and their volunteers liked the touch points. It was easy to advertise to working people and retired people, come work with kids, grow your community, support your community. But there were people who were turned off by not knowing if their time and efforts were actually making a difference, moving the needle, changing kids' lives. And they really hungered for that. So we listened to that, and then we made sure that we could match our HELPS pitch to those questions and those longings, really. Then finally, I, coming from a school base, knew that schools had multiple pain points that this program could solve. Student intervention needs, this fluency in particular, and the coordination of volunteers who wanted to support their students. But coordination of volunteers is a full-time job, and no school has, that we were going into, has a paid staff member who can only coordinate volunteers, right? Teachers just wear multiple hats. So we got HELPS approved by the district on the standard treatment protocol list. And then we explained how we would be recruiting, training, and coordinating the tutors. And so we had 13 schools, maybe 12, that signed on and agreed to learn with us. Now, not all of them made it to the end, but we had 13 right away that said, yes, please come in, we'll work with you, you work with us. Then the final chunk of time was from that fall through January or so of the next year. My experience from programs and initiatives in schools taught me that anything that's not in place by January of a school year is likely to flop and fizzle. Monroe kind of backed this up. He alluded to it earlier by showing me some research that proves that kids grow at a faster rate in a first semester than a second semester. I was going on some intuition, but I really appreciated that backing from him. And so I knew that that fall to winter time was key to make high leverage improvements alongside strong implementation to prove that HELPS worked. Serving students who qualified for the program and serving those students in our partner schools that we had committed to, serving them well. So we knew that we needed to gather student data. And our student data started by just getting a number eligible, and then it evolved to the students who were scheduled for 3 times a week as the program suggested, and then getting them reliable tutors to fill those 3 sessions per week. What we didn't realize was how much tutor data we were going to have to look at also. So first, we started tracking how many people were interested in tutoring and realized that number is very different than those who then make it to training, those who then start on the first day, those who then come to their sessions each week, and those who then get up to the fidelity that the kids need and deserve. So we had to evolve in what we were tracking and make sure that we were keeping those points as high as possible in order to get the outcomes for kids. Finally, we realized that our implementation team for HELPS needed to meet weekly in order to improve, because there was a lot that we were learning and trying to improve in a short amount of time. So we shared progress, gaps, problem solved, and we had to get better at solving the right problems. And then we would name our upcoming targets so that we could do it all again the next week. This got us to mid-year, and Monroe talked about mid-year benchmarking. And it showed us, when he ran the numbers, how many students made that expected mid-year growth. And here's what we learned from the bright spots that we saw that he talked about a little bit. Helps in the implementation guide suggest that students need 30 sessions over the course of the year to see improvement. So we were gunning for 30, but when we saw a few students who met and exceeded growth, the trend that we saw most often was that those students were getting closer to 40 sessions or 50 sessions. They were moving on through. So that caused us then to say, okay, these students are getting the dosage they need, they're getting high quality tutors, and make improvements. So then the improvements that we made from then on, and we could see these in the student data, increasing the dosage. Some students got extra sessions that they needed. We shifted some tutors to cover student session gaps just so that the dosage could increase. And then for the tutor data, the key improvements that we realized we needed, we're supporting a successful first day with materials and coaching so that the people we invested in actually showed up to their commitment. And then some tutors needed extra coaching so that they could improve. Some tutors wanted extra coaching, and then they would stay more engaged in the program. Some tutors needed reminders to attend. So we realized we needed a little more site coordination than we originally thought. And then each week we continued to influence our tweaks to the point where we made significant changes in how we were approaching tutor recruitment, redeployment of tutors based on student need, based on what the data was telling us about how students were performing by mid-year. We asked some tutors to go to a different student or to a different school, or we asked if anybody wanted to do extra sessions. We even learned when to stop taking in new tutors. I know that sounds crazy, but at some point, thinking back to how we wanted tutors to stay engaged and return and be happy and tell their friends, we had to honestly tell them what we were learning, that students needed to be served well by their tutors. And so we weren't going to be taking in a new student and meeting tutors for that student if we couldn't get that student 30 sessions at least before the end of the year. That's how we got to where we did by May. And I think you can too. Kim, I'm going to pass it off to you.
All right, excellent. So Kim Perkins is the Charlotte Program Director for the Helps Education Fund. They have been an amazing partner for us. We have been so close to each other that Kim actually was housed in our office prior to the pandemic, and we're excited to have Kim share with you the story from her perspective. Kim.
Thanks, Monroe. So just like Monroe said, we have worked in really close partnership with Reach Charlotte, and they actually laid the groundwork for us for the relationships at the schools that we started in. So we wouldn't be able where we are today without them. So I just wanted to thank them for that. I also just wanted to call out the Belk Foundation as well for supporting our work, and for Bank of America for all the support of the corporate volunteers that they have with us. So what I wanted to talk to you guys about is implementation and the nuances that come along with it. So we wanted to take stuff off schools' plates. We wanted to help the kids that needed the help, and nobody knew us, so we had to make a proof point. The problem was we had to stick to our guns on what we needed to make the program work, which means we needed the schools to give us some. So what did we ask from the schools? We needed certain questions asked to make sure that they were a good fit for the program. So one of the first questions that I asked going in was, would they have a staff member to serve as the primary contact between the school and our organization? So this role basically would be someone that would help identify students to nominate for the program. It would be able to communicate about scheduling, conflicts that come up, and basically, on a day-to-day basis on the floor, knowing what's going on in the classrooms. So we would need somebody there, and ideally it wouldn't be a classroom teacher. Usually it would be like a literacy facilitator that would be our main contact. The other thing that we asked for the schools to give to us is a reoccurring time block each day when helps can be delivered at least 3 times a week. So we needed at least an hour. And the reason we asked for an hour is so the volunteers can tutor at least 2 to 3 students. We were trying to maximize their time. The third thing we asked for from the school was space logistics. So if we could tutor 5 students at that 1 o'clock time period, you would also need space for 5 tutors. So you would need 10 desks in a quiet space for tutoring. So that was one of the other considerations that we asked for going into this. Now, what we learned is that at schools, transitions are frequent. So you make a relationship with one person and sometimes they go and they leave the school. So what we've learned is to try to make relationships with multiple players so you minimize that risk when somebody leaves. The next part of implementation that I want to talk about is the actual tutors and what we ask of them. So the commitment we ask from the tutors is to go through a 3.5-hour training of the program. They need to pass a CMS background check, and we ask them to commit 1 hour a week to tutor their students. Now, what we give them in support is what we call implementation coaches. So these are coaches that are staff that sit in on their sessions to make sure the tutors are following the fidelity of their program. So they give feedback and coaching and answer any questions that the tutors have. And usually at the end, we'll give them, you did these 3 things really well. And if there were things to work on, they would note that as well. And this coaching and support that we give the tutors gives them the confidence to deliver the program. Another thing that we learned is this position sort of morphed into a site coordination role a little bit. And this was the main contact the tutors had for planned absences or being sick. This is who they would communicate this to. We also asked the tutors for feedback twice a year. So we would give out surveys to figure out how we can improve the program from their perspective. And we would use this information to make adjustments for them. We also realized that we needed to make an investment in the tutors, and we needed a tool to manage all these relationships. So we invested in a database called Volunteer Matrix to house all that information. And then we also started using the app called Remind to communicate with tutors easily and quickly. So going back to implementation coaches, not only did they coach the tutors, but they reviewed the data every week. So they would review coaching data to see what tutors may need more support in implementing the program. And this is really important part of it because the fidelity of the program is where it is all at. So if it wasn't being delivered the way it's supposed to be delivered, the students wouldn't be getting it the way it was meant to be. So reviewing that data was really important, and the coaches would look at that data and see if there was a tutor that needed more support, and they would schedule another coaching session with them. So not only did the coaches review the tutor data, they would also review the student data, and they would check to make sure that the students were making their goals and make any adjustments if needed. So what we have learned with the implementation coaches, they started out that role in reviewing the data, but like I mentioned earlier, we learned in this larger system, we also needed them to act as site coordinators. So they morphed into that relationship building role with tutors and managing the tutors. So that was kind of a brief synopsis of implementation and what we've learned from it. So the 3 things there for good implementation is you need the school support, you need them to buy into it, you need the tutor support, you need to give them what they need, and the fidelity of the program are key implementations of this program.
Thanks, Kim. We appreciate it. I know we've got some questions that have come in, and we'll probably be able to dive in a little bit more in the Q&A. So next up is Jenny Ward. Jenny is Senior Vice President, Community Relations Manager at Bank of America. For those of you that don't know, Bank of America, largest bank in the United States, is located here in Charlotte, North Carolina. This is their headquarters. And Jenny has been an amazing partner with us, and the bank has been an important partner. And so, Jenny, I'm excited for you to share a little bit about the experience of Bank of America and Bank of America employees as HELPS tutors.
Hi, everyone. Can you hear me? I'm not sure if my video's on. Let's see. There we go. Great. Good afternoon. Thanks, Monroe, and thanks, Kim, for that shout out. So when I think of Reed Charlotte as a corporate funder and partner, I'll first answer the why we got involved, and then I'll just be very brief around our tutors and how we kind of keep that culture and momentum moving forward, and maybe a few ideas on how you all can work with your corporate partners. And so when we first got involved with Reed Charlotte, we really were impressed and continue to be impressed. You've heard a lot about data and intervention, and that's what we're all trying to get to. We have limited financial resources, limited human resources to attack any problem, whether it's literacy or housing or food insecurity. And so as a funder, being able to work with a model like this, where we've got Reed Charlotte at the hub, like the quarterback organization, really helps to set the agenda for our entire community. And I think it's brought us efficiency and scale. And again, all this evidence-based, strategies and data that helps us make decisions on where to pivot as a community so that everyone involved feels very aligned, to that 10-year goal. And so I'll kind of start there with why Reed Charlotte and as a funder, kind of what do we look for? The other thing that we look for, and that I think we've activated on, and we certainly are proud of this partnership, is how to bring our entire platform of Bank of America, here locally, to this initiative. And so a lot of us, think of our corporate partners, rightly so, for grants, right? The financial piece. And we really embrace a concept that is holistic. We definitely have the financial piece in there. And I think one thing that many of you will probably agree with is that in order to tackle something really huge like this in the community, you really need funders who are willing to do multi-year commitments. And I think that's probably one thing that is rare sometimes, but I think if you map it out and you get folks to align with you on that vision and how you're going to measure through that vision, that multi-year funding really helps. And so the other part of our platform is the volunteering. And so before I get to tutoring, I have to tell you that the culture at our company, and no matter if you're a Bank of America with 16,000 employees here in Charlotte and 200,000 globally, I really feel like these concepts can be implemented at smaller organizations. And so the idea that you have a culture of volunteering, I think that is incredibly important. That has to be the backbone and the foundation. And what I mean by that is, at least for the bank, we have 2 hours of paid time per week for our employees to engage in volunteering. And that just makes it easy right there, right? It's accepted, it's a norm, it's who we are as a company. And I think having a policy like that, it kind of starts there. Secondly, we make it really easy for our employees to connect. We have information sessions. We have an email that goes out every other week to those 16,000 employees that says 3 things to know in our market. And my communications partner on the team, Amanda Beecham, is a true guru in how to make something really succinct and meaningful. So literacy for us is tied to economic mobility. So my second point about activating on the platform for your employees, make it easy, have a policy, but also make it relevant. And so we at Bank of America, our whole foundation strategy and community involvement is based on driving upward mobility or economic mobility. And we know that, this 3rd grade reading proficiency and literacy is really a milestone in what goes on, from there for that student in life, in school success and career success. So being able to net that together for your employees, I think, is really, really important for your funders to kind of connect the dots. So when you're meeting with funders, maybe ask them, what are those community and system things that you're trying to change and how do you fit into that? I think that just makes it more of that multi-year expectation and program that employees can feel that they belong to and that we can retain them. So for tutoring, we actually, even through the pandemic, have been able to retain many of our tutors for helps, as well as spread the word on how to get involved. So I'm very happy about that. The other part about our Bank of America tutors is that we hold sessions to get their feedback. So last year, my colleague Grace Nystrom did focus groups. So I think, we owe it to our employees to ask, how's it going? What could be improved? What are you seeing? And so I think sometimes it's a one-way, we may view it as a one-way volunteering, but I think what we've been able to do is really view our tutors as extensions of our company and those ambassadors in the community. We value their input. And Bank of America employees, I hope this is consistent, but I think they really want to help improve the process. They don't want to just, stuff a backpack. They want to help solve something. And so engaging that employee base is really important. The other part that I'll mention is that we also have a creative opportunity here in Charlotte, both with our Executive Zone Loan program and our long-term skill-based volunteers program. And for Read Charlotte, we have Steve Goodman, who I think is on this call and webinar. So an executive on loan, we actually pay their salary for an entire year to 2 years and really lend the expertise of one of our executives for a nonprofit. And so we're just thrilled. And I think that kind of rounds out our platform and our engagement with Read Charlotte, because what Steve does is provide both the expertise out and the connection back in. And so if you're not able to do an executive on loan or something that extensive, I think it's really important to have a point person. It's not just me. We've got a team of folks that engage with reading literacy, with tutoring, even outside of Read Charlotte. So you really create that critical mass and something that you can carry forward year after year. So I will stop there. I'm looking at my notes to see if I forgot anything important. But I think I'll stop there. So thank you.
Thank you, Jenny. I'm excited to bring in Johanna Anderson, the Executive Director of the Belk Foundation. Johanna has both been a tutor herself, but also the Belk Foundation has been an important funder of HELPS. And Johanna also played a really pivotal role in creating Read Charlotte from the very beginning. So excited to have her give you her perspective on Read Charlotte as a funder. Johanna.
Great, thanks, Monroe. I will keep this brief for y'all. I have two declarations for funders. So I know there are a lot of United Way and funder folks on this call. So listen up. This is my learned the hard way advice for y'all. The first is full disclosure. I've been in this role, this is my 12th year, and pre-Read Charlotte, pre-Monroe, I really thought about evidence-based as a binary term. You either told me you were or you weren't, and I took that on its word. And so really had to learn to not just assume it was an either or, but scrutinize what that evidence-based claim meant and ask questions about how much, for what kids, under what circumstances, in order to get those results. So that's my first hard, embarrassing lesson learned, is to really question what that means. And if you're still like me and trying to wrap your head around effect sizes, I have surrounded myself with a cadre of really bright people like Monroe, but also researchers at area universities who get very excited when they ask for someone to tell them, can you look at this research finding and just tell me in plain English, what does this actually mean? So I, constantly try and do that and learn from them as I'm, getting pitched evidence-based ideas. The second lesson learned that I would give to you all is You know, I'd like to think that I never practiced this, but there's always been a little bit of an element of survival of the fittest with our nonprofit partners in town, right? You know, new intervention comes in and you may throw a little money at it and say, prove yourself. Let's, you know, if they're successful, if they can get done what they say they can get done, great, maybe we'll give them another year of funding. And folks, we don't have time for that. And the needs are too great right now to roll the dice and leave nonprofits on their own, particularly ones, and I think you've heard again and again as we talk about what it took to implement and scale helps, and the work is not done yet. There's still so much more in town. When they rely on system coordination and large numbers of volunteers, we cannot expect shoestring nonprofits to come into a new community and do that on their own. And I think we all know that as funders, we can open doors that otherwise take a lot more knocks from other people. So I really do encourage you, when you find that evidence-based intervention, be it HELPS, which we strongly support, but any others, not just saying, all right, we're going to help you by writing you this one check, come back to us next year and let us know how it goes. But think about those connections that you can make, be it to other funders or to those corporate volunteers, system leaders. Those are my two bits of advice. Take them for what they are.
Thanks, Johanna. That sounds like really great advice. Okay. Well, I want to thank all our panelists. Hopefully, everyone gleaned a lot of great insights. Jenny, where are we at with questions?
So first of all, I'd like to say that Sonia has been busily answering some of the questions in the Q&A box. So if you see one in the answered tab, go ahead and click if you don't see her answer, because she has included a lot of great information in answers to those questions. And so what I think what we'll do is then just go through the ones that aren't answered first. So the first one, Monroe, is, can you speak to how you use your findings to influence systems to move forward and implement the evidence-based practices that you identify? In other words, how are you using your information as a critical friend when you aren't always the decision maker?
Yeah, so you know, one of the key principles that we talk with our team about is achieving outcomes through influencing others. And so, you know, at the end of the day, we need to make all of this information research accessible to people and in plain English. So a lot of the work that you see, you know, trying to find visual ways to explain something as esoteric as an effect size is one of the ways we do that. I will say it's been many cups of coffee and lots of work to help people understand who you are. I mean, you heard Sonia and Kim make a reference to the partners that we were, you know, helped bring together. That took a lot of work and a lot of listening and a lot of conversations. I've probably given over 400 talks across our community over the last 5.5 years. But one piece of advice I got was from a former superintendent here in Charlotte. And he said to me several years ago, and I'm so grateful for this advice. He said, Monroe, people are going to change, policies are going to change, but the research and data won't change. Stay focused on the research and data and you won't go wrong. And that's what I've done. So we really try to stay grounded in that. And we try to help people understand it. Doesn't mean you're going to change their mind right away. But it does help you keep you a true north while you're trying to navigate through what sometimes can be choppy waters.
Great, thanks, Monroe. All right, another question we have here. I'd love to hear more about the role of NARN and implementation science and evaluation in determining which interventions were the best fit for Charlotte. How do you think about that?
Yeah, so NERN is the National Implementation Research Network. It's located at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. They've got some great resources that I recommend people check out. One of the key ideas is implementation stages. And so you're really thinking carefully about where you are and where you're trying to implement. You know, one of the key things they talk about is focusing on implementation outcomes first before student outcomes. So a lot of what Sonia talked about in those early stages, especially the first semester, was a lot of focus on implementation quality. There is, and I want to separate out intervention fidelity and implementation fidelity. Intervention fidelity is, are you implementing the HELPS program as intended? Implementation fidelity is, are kids getting their 3 sessions? Are we having tutors come in and make up or help tutors who can't get there? Naming, measuring, and tracking implementation outcomes is really critical. But I will tell you, I knew we could do this after the end of the first summer, because one of the groups that we partnered with in our first pilot in the summer of 2018 is called Urban Promise Charlotte. And it's a wonderful organization. Christine Kitt, their literacy facilitator, is a wonderful, wonderful partner. And she really got helps. But they work with high school students. So I watched those students get trained. And then we went some weeks later and watched them deliver the program. And when I saw that high school students could deliver this, I knew we could do it in Charlotte.
Great, thank you. Have parents been trained to use HELPS in a home environment with positive impact, or how are parents involved?
Here in Charlotte, we have not trained parents. There is one research study that John Begany, who is a professor at NC State and the founder and developer of HELPS, the founder of HELPS Education Fund and the developer of HELPS, there was a research study that did this with parents over the summer. They showed positive effects. I don't remember the numbers. It's been a few years since I've looked at it. That just hasn't been anything that we've taken on here in Charlotte. But I always have it in the back of my head that it's possible. Going back to the hexagon tool, I'm really nervous about how well we can do it. And so we've really focused on the volunteers and tutors where we have more confidence we could do it. But in theory, it's possible.
And I would also add, I think you are doing a lot with parents, just not necessarily with this particular program.
That's correct.
Thanks. Can you describe the communication tool with students, Remy?
Okay, that's Remind. Kim Perkins, this is for you. This is your question.
So the communication tool, it's an app called Remind, and that was what we used with the tutors. So if, say, a student didn't show up to class or was absent one day, we would try to catch the tutors before they left to drive to the school. So it was just an app that we would use to communicate with the tutors that they would get on their phone. So that's all that was.
Great, yeah, so you can download that. And actually, Kim, while you're there, I think you touched on a little bit, but is there anything else you would want to say about sort of the transition from the in-person tutoring to the online tutoring?
Yeah, so when we closed down March 13th last year, we started thinking right away about how we would transition if school was going to be online. And we actually had 4 sites this summer that we piloted the virtual helps in. And we learned a lot what not to do and what to do. And we are now, in schools right now doing virtual helps. It's all over Zoom, the way we're doing it. And it's just different logistics that we have to figure out. Instead of physically getting the tutors to the right classroom, it's now making sure they're on the right Zoom link.
Gotcha. Thank you, Kim. So one more question here. What is your fiscal sustainability plan?
Does that mean for Read Charlotte, or does that mean for HELPS tutoring?
Yeah, I am not positive. I don't know if this person wants to add some additional context. So maybe we can wait and see if they do. There was another question about the resource at UNC. That was NERN, you said. Do you want to just say who that is again?
Yeah.
Monroe?
It's the National Implementation Research Network. I just put in the chat a link to NERN's site and the great resources they have on implementation science.
Great. All right. Thanks. Sustainability for Read Charlotte. We have a reply to your question.
Okay, so we have a rather unique model that I give huge credit to Johanna Anderson and the others to put Read Charlotte together. So we are designed as a 10-year initiative, and our fundraising is done in 5-year tranches. So think about it like private equity or venture capital. And funders, we raise a set amount over a 5-year period. And it's sort of like your NPR station. We go through a period of time when we go out and we raise our 5-year budget. And then once we raise what we need, we stop raising for us. We may go out and help coordinate funding for projects. And we've done a lot of that. To date, we've helped coordinate $7 million of what we call strategic co-funding in targeted programs. We bring the funding together, a community together 3 times a year. And then there's a fair amount of other behind the scenes support we do with funders. Johanna is referred to us sometimes as an outsourced program officer for the funding community. And that certainly is something that we do. We are close to finishing our second 5-year round. So we have a little bit left to raise to finish out through 2024. But the other part that makes the model different is that the lead funders who put in the first time around, it was a minimum of 300,000 over 3 years, so 100,000 a year. They get a seat on the board, and so you get to see your investment up close, and you get to hopefully learn a lot as well. Johanna, is there anything else you would add? You're both a board member and a funder, and you helped put this model together.
So it was really important for us when we were in the design phase of Reach Charlotte back in, 2014. We had seen initiatives like this be stood up before in our community, where maybe they had the first year or two of seed funding, but they, after getting their staff in place and getting a plan in place, they were back to having to raise funding again. And we just said, you know what, if we're going to recruit the best and the brightest across the nation to lead this work, we don't want to have him or her spend 80% of their time fundraising. And so it was a commitment from the design team, who was made up largely of funders and kind of grass tops folks in our community, to make that initial 5-year commitment. And the funders, it's kind of positive peer pressure. We hold that expectation across each other to make this longer term commitment. And I think having multiple avenues to remain involved in Reach Charlotte and to have it provide so much value to our own grant making responsibilities and our own investment knowledge in the community has helped kind of sustain this model over time.
Thanks.
Thanks, Johanna and Monroe. All right, one more question, and you may see the poll coming up on your screen. Go ahead and do the poll while you're listening. We have a question. So great to hear about this work. There have been several references to piloting. Can you talk a bit more about the importance of pilots and how you've used them?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I often think about risk and uncertainty of outcomes. One of the reasons that we like evidence-based interventions is that it's increasing our degree of confidence for what we can expect, and not having the kind of evidence I told you feels like driving blind. Like I have no idea what to expect. But we focus as much on what's called the knowing doing gap. And if you're interested, I highly recommend this book by Jeffrey Pfeffer, is a professor at Stanford, The Knowing Doing Gap. It's about how do you turn evidence-based knowledge into actions that produce results in the real world. And so the big risk we have is how can we actually show we can implement? So you heard Sonia talk about steps we were taking to improve the quality of implementation so that we could get to the results that the research told us was possible. And so the importance of pilots is really about us learning how we can implement, what are the factors that may get in the way, what are the sticky points, because although you can see the results from high quality research, oftentimes there are research settings that you can't replicate. So one of the other interventions that we've looked at that was school-based, I was reading one of the research studies, and they said they had 19 staff members from a university that were at that school making sure it was implemented well. Well, that's not realistic in the real world. So, we're also looking for, okay, are there real world examples where there aren't 19 staff members from universities? So, we think about pilots as opportunities to learn. The thing that I would say, and we've always had the superintendent of Charlotte Mecklenburg Schools on our board, and we feel really fortunate for that. But the first superintendent who was on the board when I started in 2015, name was Ann Clark, and some advice she gave me was, you know, Monroe, we're really good about pilots. We often get stuck in pilot. And so I think the thing for us too is to not get stuck in pilot. And so we would tend to use more of, let's say, a lean startup idea. Let's start with a minimum viable product. Let's do enough that we can learn to implement and throw that into a continuous improvement cycle. But it's got to be about the learning and reducing the risk so that we can have confidence that we can execute at scale. And I would say on behalf of all of our colleagues in our third year of supporting HELPS, we have a lot more information and there's a lot less risk that things we don't know about what does it take to be able to scale this and to be able to serve even more students than we ever have before.
Thank you. I like that. Don't get stuck in the pilot. Any last questions you have? We have probably about a minute if anyone has one last question that they haven't asked yet. And while we wait to see, I was going to ask you, Monroe, if you had any sort of closing thoughts on for people that are starting on this process and how do they, without maybe time to review every piece of research that you have reviewed, any sort of lessons learned that might be helpful. But, that last comment you made summed up so much of it, but I will throw it out there again, just in case there's anything else that comes to mind about that.
Yes, so two things. One of my favorite sites to visit for like a nice summary of evidence is the Washington State Institute for Public Policy. They have a wonderful cost benefit analysis. They do, I think, pre-K-12 education and other topics as well, but they do really good work in summarizing. And what I like about them is not only are they looking at programs, but they're heavily focused on practices, which is a lot of what we're going to deal with, right? Not all the programs you're going to have in your community is going to have an evidence-based anything to it, but understanding it as a practice. If you understand what's the evidence around adult one-to-one tutoring that, where the adults have training that allows you to have a little more confidence in, okay, let's make sure that the volunteers are supported the way that Kim talked about, but you have something to build on, something to base your understanding on. And so I highly recommend that. The last thing that I would say, though, is that I want to make sure that throughout this entire presentation that we haven't inadvertently made you think, oh, no, I don't have evidence. What I have is bad. That's not what we're saying. What we're saying is be informed that if you don't have the evidence that you want, ask, well, why not? And what do we need to know to understand what the impact is? But even if you see something that didn't have as much impact as you might want, ask, how might we make this better? What are things that we could do to improve? And we showed examples of some really low-cost ways to measure, are we seeing growth compared to what we'd otherwise expect to see? Are we closing a gap that we would like to see towards end-of-year benchmarks? And to really set yourself an agenda for how you use this information to be more informed about the choices you make, but also to help inform your own improvement journey in your community.
Great, thank you, Monroe. I think that's a great way to sum up really this comprehensive picture we've gotten of not only how you at Reach Charlotte think about selecting and implementing programs, but how you do it specifically with one program. And I know for me, it's been very helpful to see sort of the real life examples that all of you have given. So thank you so much to all of you, Monroe, Sonia, Kim, Jenny, and Johanna, for everything that you have shared with us. It's really wonderful to learn more about what you're doing and to also have so many connections to help us think about how we may be able to do similar things that work in our communities as well. So thank you again. Thanks to all of you who joined us today for participating in our webinar. We're going to just put up very quickly the upcoming webinars. So in case you didn't see them at the beginning, you can take a look now. We have another one happening in about an hour. Our Science Matters webinar series, The Future of Early Math, What Science and Practice Tells Us. Then we have two more next Tuesday, our Making Small Moments Big for Children's Early Brain Development with the Clinton Foundation. and parent coaching, a key ingredient to parent and child success. And then the following week, our Learning Loss Recovery Challenge webinar on teaching early reading with a digital mindset, as well the following week, December 1st, we're almost to December, a virtual tutoring webinar, how programs are pivoting to combat learning loss. So we hope you'll join us again on one of our upcoming webinars. Thanks again to everyone today, and have a wonderful afternoon.